The cantina aboard Harmony's Rest buzzed with the quiet conversations of warriors from across the galaxy. Smoke from a dozen different worlds drifted through the air, mixing the sweet scent of Andromedan spice with the sharp tang of vegan whiskey. Commander Velther of the Corvani Empire sat hunched over his crystalline ale, his massive purple carapace bearing the scars of a dozen campaigns. Each mark told a story of survival against impossible odds. Around him, veterans from 6 different species shared war stories and bitter drinks. There was Captain Nix, a reptilian saurian whose emerald scales still bore the white marks of plasma burns from the Outer Rim conflicts. His forked tongue flicked out nervously as he sipped his drink. Beside him sat Engineer Korth, a floating, jellyfish-like Medusae whose translucent body pulsed with bioluminescent memories of battles fought in the void between stars. The conversation had been flowing for hours, each warrior trying to top the last with tales of courage and horror. They spoke of the Crystal Wars, where entire planets had been turned to glass. They remembered the Hive Queen's last stand on Epsilon Prime, where millions of insectoid warriors had fought to the death rather than surrender their royal mother. "Tell us about the worst enemy you ever faced," urged Captain Nix, his vertical pupils dilating as he leaned forward. The scales along his neck flared slightly, a sign of genuine curiosity among his people. Velther's mandibles clicked nervously, the sound echoing like castanets in the sudden quiet that had fallen over their corner of the cantina. His forearms shifted restlessly, to reaching for his drink while the others drummed against the metal table. After a long silence that stretched uncomfortably, he spoke in his gravelly voice, each word seeming to scrape against his throat. "Humans." The table fell silent. Even the background chatter from nearby tables seemed to fade as if the word itself carried some dark power. Most had never heard the name, though a few exchanged worried glances. The Medusae's glow dimmed to almost nothing, a sign of fear among her species. "Humans," Captain Nix repeated, his tongue tasting the unfamiliar word. "Never heard of them, some kind of hive mind species. Cybernetic warriors." Velthar shook his massive head slowly, his compound eyes reflecting the cantina's dim lighting like scattered jewels. "Nothing like that. They look almost ordinary. 2 arms, 2 legs, soft skin with no natural armor. No claws, no venom, no natural weapons at all." This drew confused murmurs from the group. Korth's jellyfish form pulsed with questioning colors. "Then how could they be dangerous? Surely your plasma cannons would cut through them like tissue paper." "That's what we thought." Velther's voice carried the weight of terrible memory. "It was at Kepler Station, 3 years ago. I was leading an assault battalion against what intelligence told us was a minor species. Just another expansion conflict, you understand. We had superior numbers, better weapons, advanced tactics that had worked against 100 other worlds." He took a long drink, the crystalline ale glowing briefly as it passed through his translucent throat. "We knew nothing about humans." His compound eyes grew distant, seeing not the cantina but a battlefield painted in fire and blood. The station was a simple mining outpost, maybe 3,000 inhabitants. Our fleet dropped out of hyperspace at dawn, ship time. Standard intimidation display, 12 battlecruisers, enough firepower to crack a moon. We broadcast surrender demands in 47 languages. "Did they respond?" asked Captain Nix. "Oh, they responded." Velther's mandibles clicked in what might have been bitter laughter. A single human voice, mail.com as deep space. He said, "This is Commander Park Minsu of Kepler Station. We decline your offer. You may begin your attack when ready." The veterans around the table exchanged glances. Such casual defiance in the face of overwhelming force was either madness or supreme confidence. "We thought it was a translation error," Velthar continued. "No species facing extinction would be so ... polite about it. My tactical officer Grixton ran the message through cultural analysis programs. Nothing. The human was simply being courteous while refusing to surrender." He paused to drain his glass, the empty crystal ringing softly as he set it down. "The first wave hit their outer defenses at 0800 standard. Textbook assault pattern, plasma bombardment followed by shock troops. But when our plasma fire tore through their defensive positions, something impossible happened." Velther's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing the others to lean close. "The wounded ones, they kept fighting. Not just fighting, they fought harder, more precisely, more lethally." Captain Nix leaned forward, his scales bristling with interest. Adrenaline surge. "Most species have that response to mortal injury." "No." Velther's voice carried absolute certainty. "I've seen adrenaline responses. This was different. I watched A human soldier named Daho continued firing his weapon with surgical precision, even though his left arm had been completely severed by plasma fire. The limb was gone, just a cauterized stump, but he braced his rifle against a barrier and kept shooting. His accuracy never wavered. The Medusi's form pulsed with disturbed colors, perhaps cybernetic enhancement. Pain substances. That's what I thought until I saw his medic. Veltha's mandibles clicked rapidly now, a sign of deep agitation. A human female called Mina. She was performing surgery on another wounded soldier while enemy fire rained around them like metal rain. Plasma bolts were vaporizing the ground, inches from her position, and she was humming. Captain Nix's forked tongue flicked out in confusion, some strange melody, soft, almost peaceful. Her hands never shook, not once, even as her comrades screamed in pain around her. She worked with the focused precision of someone arranging flowers, not someone trying to save a life under fire. When she finished, the soldier she'd operated on Kyun, I think his name was, immediately grabbed his rifle and returned to the fight. Half his chest was held together with emergency foam and synthetic skin, but he moved like he was completely uninjured. The other veterans exchanged uneasy glances. Such behavior was beyond their understanding. Most species either fled when severely wounded or fell into shock. The idea of becoming more effective after injury was alien to their experience. That was just the beginning, Velthar continued, his voice growing stronger as if he needed to tell this story, needed others to understand what he had witnessed. By the end of the first day, we realized we weren't fighting soldiers, we were fighting something else entirely, something that treated death not as an ending, but as just another tactical consideration. The cantina around them seemed to fade away as Velthar's words painted pictures of a battlefield where the impossible had become routine, where soft-skinned beings without natural weapons had somehow turned their very vulnerability into their greatest strength. The second time I encountered humans was on Verdania Prime. Velthar continued, his voice growing more strained. The crystalline ale in his glass seemed to darken as his mood shifted, reflecting the bioluminescent patterns that flickered across his carapace when he was deeply troubled. Dense jungle world, 90% humidity, canopy so thick that orbital scans were useless. Perfect terrain for hidden-run tactics. He paused, his large compound eyes reflecting the cantina's dim lights like fractured mirrors. Each facet seemed to hold a different memory of that cursed world. My reconnaissance unit was tasked with clearing a sector of human special forces. Intelligence said there were maybe 30 of them scattered across 100 square kilometers. Of jungle should have been simple. Captain Nix's scales rippled with interest. As a veteran of jungle warfare himself, he understood the challenges. Thermal imaging would give you a massive advantage in that environment. Heat signatures stand out like beacons in dense vegetation. That's what we thought. Velthar's mandibles clicked in bitter memory. For 3 weeks, we hunted them, or so we thought. My Lieutenant Grixkin was confident. The fool actually volunteered for the mission. We had the latest thermal imaging arrays, motion sensors, sensitive enough to detect a butterfly's heartbeat, atmospheric processors that could track biosignatures. 4 kilometers through the thickest jungle canopy, he gestured with one of his 4 arms, painting invisible pictures of high-tech warfare. Our powered armor could punch through tree trunks. Our weapons could vaporize anything organic within a 2-meter radius. How could a primitive species evade our technology? They didn't even have energy shields. Captain Nix nodded slowly. Standard counterinsurgency operations. Superior technology, overwhelming firepower, precise intelligence. What went wrong? Velthar's carapace seemed to darken, the purple hue shifting toward deep violet. Everything. From the very first day, nothing went according to plan. The first sign something was wrong came on day 3. Trooper Kelm went missing during a routine perimeter sweep. The Medusi engineer Korth pulsed with questioning colors. Killed. We found him 6 hours later, hanging upside down from a tree branch 30 meters off the ground, alive but unconscious. No injuries, no sign of struggle, just suspended there like some kind of jungle fruit. Velthar's voice grew quieter. When he woke up in the medical bay, he kept babbling about eyes in the darkness. Said he'd felt like he was being watched for hours before the attack, but our sensors showed nothing. Stealth technology, suggested Captain Nix. That's what we'd assumed, but when we reviewed the recordings from Kelm's armor, we found something impossible. For 3 hours before he lost consciousness, his suit's proximity alarms should have been screaming. Multiple heat signatures moving around him, staying just outside sensor range, but the signatures were all wrong. Velthar took a long drink, his hands trembling slightly. The other veterans noticed but said nothing. They all had missions that haunted them. Wrong, how? Pressed the Saurian captain. Too cold. Human body temperature should register at 37 degrees standard. These signatures were showing 28, 29 degrees. Like they were somehow controlling their own biology. The table fell silent as the implications sank in. Most species could regulate their body temperature to some degree, but not while maintaining peak physical performance. Psychological warfare offered Korth, her jellied form flickering with nervous bioluminescence. Worse than that, they were learning us. Veltha's voice carried a weight of horror that made the others lean back instinctively. Every day, one of my soldiers would disappear, for a few hours and return unharmed but completely terrified. Always the same pattern, they'd be found unconscious in impossible locations. No memory of how they got there. He counted off on his fingers. Brick still found tied to a branch 60 meters up with vines. Skelmer discovered buried up to his neck. In soft earth, perfectly positioned so he could breathe but couldn't move. Zorgoth suspended over a river by spider silk so fine our sensors couldn't detect it. But alive, noted Captain Nix. They were sending a message. More than that. We started finding evidence of human presence everywhere after that. Footprints that followed our exact patrol routes, perfectly matching our stride patterns. Empty ration packs placed where we'd camped the night before, arranged in neat little pyramids. Equipment moved exactly 1 meter to the left while we slept. Veltha's mandibles clicked rapidly, the sound like rattling bones. The worst part was the gifts. Every morning we'd find something new. Flowers arranged in perfect geometric patterns around our tents. Fruit from trees that only grew on the other side of the continent, somehow delivered fresh overnight. Once, someone had braided grass into tiny sculptures of each member of my unit. Perfect likenesses, down to the scars on Grixkin's armor. The cantina around them seemed to grow quieter, as if other patrons were unconsciously avoiding their conversation. On day 12, we finally intercepted human communications. Our cryptolinguists had been working around the clock to break their encryption. When we finally decoded a transmission, we wished we hadn't. Velthor's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. A soldier named Taman was reporting to his commander about our unit. Standard intelligence gathering, said Captain Nix. His tone suggested he suspected otherwise. He knew every member of my unit by name. Not just names, he knew that Grixkin favored his left side due to shrapnel damage from the Centauri campaign. He knew that Trooper Kelm had a nervous habit of checking his weapon's charge level twice before each patrol. He knew that I had a slight limp from an old injury that didn't show up on medical scans. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Personal details that should have been impossible to observe from a distance. Velthar continued. But the transmission contained something even more disturbing. Taman was discussing how to redirect our movement patterns to minimize collateral damage to local wildlife. They weren't just hunting us. They were concerned about disturbing the ecosystem while they did it. Korth's form pulsed with confused colors. They were protecting the jungle. They had been following us for nearly 2 weeks, studying us like researchers studying lab specimens, learning our habits, our weaknesses, our individual psychological profiles, and they were doing it all on foot. Velthar stood suddenly, pacing to the cantina's viewing port where Vidania Prime was visible as a green dot among the stars. No vehicles, no advanced technology beyond basic camping gear. Just humans with backpacks and primitive projectile weapons, walking through terrain that should have been impossible to traverse. Jungle that took our powered suits hours to cross. They moved through like it was an open field. Impossible, muttered Captain Nix. The energy expenditure alone would kill most species. That's what we thought. But we kept finding evidence they never stopped. Footprints in mud that showed they were walking through the night, in total darkness, through swampland where one wrong step meant death. Our atmospheric processors detected their biosignatures moving constantly, covering distances that should have required days of rest. Velthar returned to his seat, his movements heavy with remembered exhaustion. When we finally tried to escape to the extraction point, calling for immediate evacuation, we discovered something that still gives me nightmares. The humans hadn't just been following us, they had been hurting us. Every time we changed direction, every tactical decision we made, had been subtly influenced by what we found in our path. A fallen log blocking one route, forcing us down another. A convenient clearing that seemed perfect for overnight camping, positioning us exactly where they wanted us. We thought we were making command decisions, but we were just following a script they had written, the implications hung in the air like toxic gas. To be outmaneuvered by superior technology was one thing, but to be psychologically manipulated by beings with no apparent advantages was something else entirely. The extraction ship found us 3 days later, huddled in our powered armor, afraid to sleep, afraid to move. 30 humans had turned a veteran reconnaissance unit into a group of terrified children, and they had done it without firing a single shot. Velthor's next story began with a shudder that ran through his entire carapace, the purple plates shifting and clicking like armor settling after a hard impact. The sound made several nearby patrons glance over nervously before returning to their own conversations. He reached for another crystalline ale, his 4 hands trembling slightly as he gripped the glass. Fortress Kethma, he said, the name dropping like a stone into still water. Strategic position overlooking the neutral zone, massive defensive installation carved into a mountain face, plasma cannons that could vaporize a battle cruiser, shield generators powerful enough to deflect asteroid impacts. The other veterans knew the fortress by reputation. It was considered one of the most impregnable positions in known space, a monument to military engineering that had never fallen to enemy assault. We held it with 2,000 of the Empire's finest troops, continued elite shock infantry, veteran artillery crews, pilots who had fought in a dozen campaigns. The humans attacking us had maybe 300 soldiers, lightly armed, no heavy weapons, no air support. Should have been a massacre. Captain Nix's scales rippled with confusion. 300 against 2,000, in a fortified position. That's not warfare, that's suicide. That's what I thought. Velthar's compound eyes seemed to darken as the memories surfaced. Our intelligence briefings said the humans were desperate, making a final push before their main forces arrived. Standard tactics would be to hit us with everything they had, try to overwhelm our defenses through sheer brutality. He paused to take a long drink, the crystalline liquid glowing as it passed through his translucent throat. The first assault came at dawn, local time. I was in the command center, watching through our tactical displays as 300 human soldiers advanced across 2 kilometers of open ground. No cover, no concealment, just walking straight toward our guns. Walking. The Medusi engineers' form pulsed with disbelief. Across open ground under defensive fire. Not walking, marching, in perfect formation, like they were on parade. Velthor's mandibles clicked slowly. But that wasn't the strangest part. They were singing. The table fell silent. Even the background noise of the cantina seemed to fade. As the other veterans tried to process this information, singing Captain Nix's forked tongue flicked out nervously. War chants. Battle hymns designed to intimidate. No. Velthor's voice carried an odd note of wonder mixed with horror. Lullabies. Soft, haunting melodies that carried across the battlefield like music from a dream. My tactical officer Brixtel identified at least 12 different songs, all of them gentle, peaceful, the kind of music you'd sing to calm a frightened child. He gestured with one arm toward the cantina speakers, where soft instrumental music played in the background. Imagine that sound, but voices. Human voices harmonizing as plasma fire streaked over their heads. My soldiers were so confused they actually stopped shooting for almost 30 seconds. Psychological warfare, suggested Korth, her jellied form, flickering with nervous bioluminescence, designed to create hesitation in enemy forces. I thought so too, until I saw what happened next. Velthor's voice cracked slightly, showing an emotional vulnerability that shocked the other veterans. They had never seen the stoic Corvani commander display such feeling. When our defensive fire finally resumed, it cut through their front ranks like a scythe through grain. Dozens of humans fell in the first volley, and the singing stopped, asked Captain Nix. It got louder. Velthor's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of deep distress among his species. The wounded ones, the dying ones, they kept singing. A human soldier named Junho took a direct plasma hit to the chest. As he lay there, his armor melting, he was still humming one of their lullabies. The horror of the image settled over the table like a toxic cloud. Most species, when mortally wounded, would scream or fall silent. The idea of maintaining such calm in the face of death was beyond their understanding. But that was just the beginning, Velthor continued. As the battle intensified, I witnessed something that still haunts my dreams. A human medic named Sujin broke from their advancing formation and ran directly into our crossfire, not toward her own wounded, toward one of my soldiers, one of yours. Captain Nix's vertical pupils dilated with shock. Private Zorkith had taken shrapnel from an exploding power cell. He was lying in no man's land, 50 meters from either force, bleeding out. Sujin sprinted across open ground while plasma bolts vaporized the earth around her feet. She was crying as she ran. Velthor's voice grew softer, forcing the others to lean close. When she reached Zorkith, she didn't even check if he was friend or enemy. She just saw a wounded being and started working. Tears were falling on his wounds while she tried to save his life. Real tears, not some tactical deception. She saved an enemy soldier. The disbelief in Captain Nix's voice was absolute. While her own people were dying around her, I watched through battlefield cameras as she worked. Her hands were steady, professional, but her face was streaming with tears. She was mourning every casualty on both sides simultaneously. Velthor stood and began pacing, his agitation making his carapace shimmer with stress patterns. And she wasn't the only one. During the heaviest fighting, when our artillery was pounding their positions, I watched a human named J1 carry 3 of my wounded troops to safety. He took plasma burns across his back doing it. His armor was melting, but he never stopped. The cantina around them seemed to fade away as Velta's words painted pictures of impossible heroism. Another human, Minjun, used his own body to shield a group of injured Corvani from falling debris when we collapsed part of the outer wall. He didn't know them, had no reason to protect them, but he threw himself over them anyway. "This makes no tactical sense," muttered Korth. "Wasting resources on enemy casualties reduces combat effectiveness." "That's exactly what I thought," Vel replied, until I realized what was happening to my own forces. By the second day of fighting, something unprecedented was occurring in my ranks. Half my soldiers were refusing to fire on human medics. They would target human soldiers, human officers, human artillery positions, but they wouldn't shoot the medical personnel. Captain Nix's scales bristled with confusion. Combat doctrine clearly states that enemy medical personnel are legitimate targets. Try explaining that to Trooper Gexmel after he watched a human medic named the Jin spend 4 hours trying to save his squadmate's life. Try telling Sergeant Kleckstar that the human who carried him to safety under fire was just following psychological warfare protocols. Velthar's voice rose slightly, causing nearby patrons to glance over nervously. The other half of my forces were too psychologically disturbed to fight effectively. How do you maintain combat discipline against an enemy who weeps for your losses, while efficiently destroying your defensive positions? He returned to his seat, his movements heavy with exhaustion. By the third day, I was receiving reports that defied all military logic. Human soldiers would suppress our gun positions with ruthless efficiency, then immediately send medical teams to treat the wounded gunners. They would destroy our communication arrays, then help evacuate the technical staff to safety. They were fighting the installation, not the people, observed Captain Nix slowly. Exactly. They could be utterly lethal and completely compassionate in the same moment. Do you know how terrifying that is? To face an enemy who can switch between destroyer and healer without missing a beat. Velther finished his drink in one gulp, the empty crystal ringing against the metal table. On the final day, when it became clear the fortress would fall, my medical officer made a request I'll never forget. He asked permission to surrender the medical bay to the humans because they were treating our wounded better than our own medical corps. The silence that followed was profound. Each veteran around the table was trying to process the implications of what they had heard. "That's when I understood," Velther whispered. "These weren't just warriors, they were something else entirely. Something that saw enemy soldiers not as targets to be eliminated, but as fellow beings caught in the same terrible circumstances. They fought not because they hated us, but because they loved something more than they feared death." "What happened to the fortress?" asked Korth quietly. "It fell, of course, but not to conquest. To something far more powerful than military might. By the time the humans reached our command center, half my remaining troops had already laid down their weapons, not in defeat, but in recognition that they were fighting people who represented something better than what we had become." Velther's compound eyes reflected the cantina's lights like scattered stars. The human commander, a woman named Park Soyoung, personally helped carry our wounded to their medical transports. She apologized for the necessity of the battle, thanked us for our courage, and promised that our injured would receive the same care as her own. The weight of the story settled over the table like a heavy blanket. Each veteran was lost in their own thoughts, trying to reconcile the image of ruthless efficiency with boundless compassion. That's when I realized, Velther concluded, that we weren't just fighting an enemy, we were fighting our own future, a glimpse of what we might become if we could find the courage to be better than our worst instincts. "Colony 7 was the worst," Velthar whispered, his voice barely audible above the cantina's background noise. The massive Corvoni warrior seemed to shrink into himself as he spoke, his purple carapace dulling to an almost grey color, his forearms wrapped around his torso as if trying to hold himself together against memories that threatened to tear him apart. He stared into his empty glass, seeing not crystalline residue but the reflection of a battle that had changed him forever. The human garrison was doomed from the moment our fleet arrived. 300 colonists, maybe 50 of them actual soldiers, holding a mining outpost on the edge of nowhere. We had 15,000 troops, orbital bombardment capability, enough firepower to glass the entire continent. Captain Nix's scales rippled with unease. 52-1 odds, no reinforcements coming, no escape route. Any rational species would have surrendered immediately. That's what Admiral Klexmore thought when he opened communications. Veltha continued. Standard surrender demand, broadcast on all frequencies, 48 hours to evacuate non-combatants. Then we'd take the colony by force. Clean, efficient, minimal casualties on both sides. The Medusi engineer pulsed with questioning colors. Did they respond? Oh, they responded. Veltha's mandibles clicked with bitter memory. Commander Sohan appeared on our screens. Human, female, maybe 40 standard years, wearing a simple, colonial uniform. She thanked us for the warning, said they appreciated our courtesy, then politely declined our offer. He paused, reaching for another drink with trembling hands. Declined, like we were offering them a business proposition instead of the chance to live. When Admiral Klexmore asked why, she said something I'll never forget, because someone has to draw the line. The cantina around them seemed to grow quieter, as if other patrons were unconsciously drawn to the gravity of Veltha's words, which gave them the full 48 hours anyway. Hoped they'd come to their senses. During that time, our intelligence officers monitored their communications. What we heard defied all military logic. Veltha's voice grew stronger, as if he needed to tell this story quickly before his courage failed. They weren't preparing defenses or planning escapes. They were saying goodbye. Personal messages to families on Earth. Letters to friends. Recordings for children who would never see their parents again. But no panic, no despair. Just ... acceptance. Acceptance of death, asked Captain Nix. Acceptance of purpose. Veltha stood and moved to the viewing port, where the stars wheeled slowly past. When the attack began, we expected token resistance followed by inevitable surrender. Instead, they activated what I later learned they called the sacrifice protocol. The other veterans leaned closer, sensing they were about to hear something that would haunt them as much as it haunted the storyteller. Not an official military doctrine, Veltha continued. No manual described it, no academy taught it, just something humans did when cornered, when facing impossible odds. They turned their mortality into a weapon. He turned back to face the table, his compound eyes reflecting pain that went deeper than physical wounds. It started with their pilot, a woman named Hai Jin, flying a single-seat fighter that looked like it belonged in a museum, defending against our entire aerospace wing. Her craft took critical damage during the first wave engine failure, life support compromised, weapons systems offline. Veltha's voice cracked slightly. Standard procedure would be to eject, try to reach friendly territory. Instead, she flew directly into our command ship, the Dominion's Fist. But before impact, she activated her personal communicator, broadcasting, on an open channel that reached all the way to Earth. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Veltha struggled with the memory. What did she say? Whispered Korth. Tell my daughter I love her. Veltha replied, his voice breaking completely. Tell her that Mummy kept her promise to always protect her. Those were her last words, broadcast across half the galaxy, right before her fighter punched through the Dominion's Fist like a kinetic projectile. Captain Nix's scales had gone completely pale. One fighter against a battlecruiser. The explosion took out their primary command deck, killed Admiral Klexmore and 30 senior officers. But that wasn't the worst part. Veltha returned to his seat, his movements heavy with exhaustion. That single act somehow transformed the entire battle. The remaining humans didn't just fight harder, they fought like they had already accepted death and were just deciding how to spend it. He counted off on his fingers, each name a dagger to his memory. Sergeant Wubin threw himself on a plasma grenade when our shock troops breached their outer perimeter. Saved his entire squad, took the full blast to his chest. Private the One manually detonated explosive charges while enemy troops swarmed over her position, bringing down half a mountainside on our advancing armor. Suicide tactics, Captain Nix muttered, but his tone suggested he knew it was more complex than that. No, you don't understand, Veltha said urgently. These weren't desperate acts of hopeless people. Each death was calculated, purposeful, designed to inflict maximum strategic damage, and somehow, each death made the survivors more dangerous, not less. He pulled up a holographic display from his personal communicator, showing tactical readouts from the battle. Look at these combat efficiency ratings. After Hyjin's sacrifice, human effectiveness increased by 30%. After Wubin died, another 20%. By the time the one detonated those charges, the remaining humans were fighting at nearly superhuman levels. The display showed impossible statistics, accuracy rates approaching 100%, tactical decisions that bordered on precognitive coordination that seemed almost telepathic. How is that possible? Asked Korth, her form flickering with disturbed bioluminescence. I think, Belthor said slowly, that watching their comrades die willingly for a cause didn't break them, it freed them. Freed them from fear, from doubt, from any concern for personal survival. They became something beyond soldiers, they became instruments of pure purpose. He manipulated the display, showing the final moments of the battle. Their last transmission came from Commander Sohyun herself. She appeared on screen in the colony's command center, plasma fire visible through the windows behind her. Half her face was burned, her uniform was torn and bloody, but her voice was completely calm. Veltha's own voice dropped to a whisper, as he quoted the human commander's final words. To anyone receiving this message, we die so others may live. Remember that freedom isn't free, and some things are worth more than life itself. Then she looked directly into the camera and said, "Goodbye, Earth. Take care of the stars for us." The holographic display showed the colony's fusion reactor, beginning to overload, its containment fields flickering red with imminent failure. She overloaded the colony's fusion reactor, Velthor continued, his voice gaining strength as he approached the climax of his tale. Not a desperate act, but a calculated military decision. She knew exactly how much damage it would cause, exactly which ships would be caught in the blast radius. The display exploded in silent light, showing the expanding sphere of nuclear fire that had consumed everything within 50 kilometers. 3 of our battle cruisers were vaporized in the explosion, Velthar said, staring at the replay. The Dominion's Fist, the Iron Talon, and the Stellar Hammer. 7,000 Corvani dead in less than 30 seconds, including my brother Kelthar. His voice broke completely on the last name, the pain of personal loss finally overwhelming. His military composure. Your brother, Captain Nix asked gently. Executive officer aboard the Iron Talon. He was preparing the occupation forces, getting ready to take prisoners and secure the colony infrastructure. The explosion caught them completely by surprise. Velthar's mandibles clicked slowly, like a funeral dirge, all to stop 300 humans who were already defeated. The silence that followed was profound, each veteran lost in their own thoughts about sacrifice and purpose. They chose mutual annihilation over surrender, Velthar whispered, not because they were fanatical or insane, but because they understood something we didn't. They knew that sometimes the message you send by dying is more powerful than anything you could accomplish by living. He looked around the table at his fellow veterans, seeing his own haunted expression reflected in their eyes. That's why Colony 7 was the worst, he concluded. Not because of the casualties or the tactical defeat, but because it showed us what we were really fighting. Not just another species competing for resources, but beings who could transform their own deaths into weapons of hope. How do you defeat an enemy who sees dying for their beliefs as victory? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. After a long silence that seemed to stretch across the vastness of space itself, Velthar spoke again, his voice steady but carrying the weight of 1,000 haunted memories. The crystalline ale had long since been forgotten, the glass sitting empty before him like a monument to all the stories he had shared. The war ended 6 months later, he said, staring at his reflection in the polished metal table, not through victory or defeat, but through something unprecedented in galactic history, mutual recognition that we were too dangerous to each other to continue fighting. Captain Nix's scales rippled with confusion. Mutual recognition. I've never heard of a war ending that way. Neither had we. Velthar's mandibles clicked slowly. Both sides had reached the same terrifying conclusion simultaneously. The humans had taught us something about warfare that changed everything we thought we knew about conflict. They showed us that a species' greatest strength often comes from embracing what others consider weaknesses. Around the table, other veterans began nodding slowly, their own memories surfacing like debris from a sunken ship. The Medusi engineer's form pulsed with thoughtful colors. while a previously silent crystalline being began to hum with harmonic frequencies that indicated deep contemplation. "I've heard similar stories," admitted Captain Nix, his forked tongue flicking out nervously. "The Saurian Fourth Fleet encountered human traders last year near the Rigel system. Peaceful contact, completely routine, but afterward our admirals issued standing orders to avoid conflict at all costs." "What happened during that encounter?" asked Korth, her jellied form brightening with curiosity. "Nothing dramatic," Captain Nix replied. "That was the problem. The human merchants were polite, professional, fair in their dealings, but our psychological evaluation teams detected something underneath the surface. A sense of controlled power, like standing next to a fusion reactor that's been carefully contained but could level a city if it ever broke free." A crystalline engineer named Keth, who had been silent until now, spoke up with the musical tones characteristic of his species. "The mining guilds have encountered human colonies throughout the Outer Rim. They report the same phenomenon: absolute courtesy, complete cooperation, and an underlying sense that these beings could become very dangerous very quickly if provoked." "Dangerous how?" pressed Korth. Keth's crystalline structure shifted to deeper hues as he considered his words. "Not through technology or superior numbers, through something harder to define." The guild representatives described it as feeling like they were negotiating with sleeping giants who were choosing to be gentle. Velthar stood slowly, his joints creaking with age and the accumulated weight of old wounds. His massive frame moved to the cantina's main viewing port, where the stars of a dozen systems twinkled in the endless black of space. Each point of light represented worlds, civilizations, stories of triumph and tragedy playing out across the galaxy. "That's exactly why I tell these stories," he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet cantina. Other patrons had unconsciously moved closer, drawn by the gravity of his words. "Humans aren't expanding into our territories not because they can't, but because they choose not to. They've shown remarkable restraint since the war ended." He gestured toward the stars with one of his forearms. "Look out there. Thousands of systems, millions of worlds. The humans have the technology to reach any of them, the numbers to colonize dozens of planets simultaneously, but they don't. They explore, they study, they make contact, but they don't conquer. And that frightens you?" asked Captain Nix. "That restraint itself is perhaps the most frightening thing about them," Velthor replied, "because it's a choice. Every day they choose not to use their full capabilities, but choice implies the ability to choose differently." The station's sensors suddenly chimed, the familiar sound announcing the passage of a nearby vessel. On the main display screen that dominated one wall of the cantina, a sleek ship glided past like a metal whale through the cosmic ocean. Its HULL bore the distinctive blue and green symbols of Earth, instantly recognizable to any being in known space. "Exploration, Vessel New Horizon," the station's AI announced in its neutral, synthetic voice. "Human registry, crew of 200, mission, deep space cartography and cultural exchange." The entire cantina fell silent as they watched the ship pass. Its design was elegant but functional, clearly built for long-range exploration rather than combat. Solar collectors gleamed along its hull, and observation domes dotted its superstructure like eyes watching the universe with wonder rather than hunger. Velthor watched the ship disappear into hyperspace, its crew completely unaware of the terror. Their very existence struck into the hearts of galactic civilization. The blue flash of its hyperspace transition painted shadows across his scarred carapace. 200 humans, he murmured, his voice barely audible but somehow carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent cantina. Probably including explorers named Minho and Yunji, scientists like Hyunwoo, and G1 engineers called Donghien and Somin, simple names for extraordinary beings. He turned back to face the crowded room, his compound eyes taking in the faces of dozens of species, Saurians and Medusae, crystallines and Corvani, beings from across the galaxy, all united in their growing understanding of what they had heard. "I've studied human culture extensively since the war," Velthor continued. "Read their literature, watched their entertainment, learned their languages. Do you know what I discovered? They have a concept they call the better angels of our nature. The idea that every being has the capacity for both creation and destruction, and that civilization comes from choosing creation." A young Saurian pilot near the back of the crowd raised her hand tentatively. "But surely they must have some weakness, some way to contain them if they become a threat." Velthor's mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter. "Their greatest weakness is also their greatest strength. They care too much. About their families, their friends, their principles, even their enemies. That caring makes them vulnerable, but it also makes them unstoppable when something they love is threatened. He moved through the crowd, his massive form parting the sea of beings like a ship cutting through water. Remember this, when humans finally decide to claim their place among the stars, it won't be through conquest, it will be through something far more powerful. Understanding the cantina's atmosphere seemed to shift as his words sank in. Conversations that had been bubbling beneath the surface fell silent as beings from across the galaxy contemplated the implications. They see the entire galaxy not as territory to be conquered, but as potential allies to be understood. Veltha continued, that perspective makes them either the greatest hope for galactic peace, or the most dangerous species ever to achieve spaceflight, because if we force them to choose between their principles and their survival, I believe they'll find a way to preserve both. He reached the cantina's exit, pausing to look back at the assembled veterans and civilians. I've seen what humans are capable of when they're pushed to their limits. I've witnessed their capacity for both mercy and destruction. But most importantly, I've learned that they see these qualities not as opposites, but as different aspects of the same fundamental truth, which is, called out Captain Nix. That every life has value, Velta replied simply, even the lives of their enemies. Even the lives of those who would destroy them. When that day comes that humans finally step forward to take their place as a galactic power, it will be because they've found a way to protect all life, not just their own. The cantina fell completely silent as Velthar departed, his footsteps echoing in the corridor beyond. Behind him, he left veterans who would spend the rest of their lives wondering whether humanity represented salvation or doom for the galaxy, and civilians who would return to their worlds carrying stories that would spread like ripples across the cosmic pond. Outside the viewing port, more human ships passed in the distance, their crews completely unaware of the conversations they inspired. They continued their quiet exploration of the cosmos, mapping new worlds, making peaceful contact with isolated civilizations, and occasionally, when no one was listening, singing lullabies to the stars themselves. In the depths of space, humanity's gentle expansion continued, guided not by conquest but by curiosity, not by fear but by hope. And across the galaxy, beings who had once been enemies found themselves sleeping a little less soundly, not because they feared human aggression, but because they feared their own inadequacy in the face of such profound decency, held its breath, waiting to see what would happen when the species that turned their mortality into a weapon finally decided to use their immortal dreams as a tool for peace. The end.